Here follows an extract from my book Artful Designs, available from Amazon. Chapter 20, Part 1. Drew had no clear idea of what was going on when he'd received the call from his brother-in-law, telling him to get to the Whitworth as a matter of urgency. Benedict gave no details. On arrival, Drew was met by a crowd of police and the all-too-familiar forensics team. However, it was James who pressed through the crowd to meet him. Dear God, Drew, this is totally out of control now, and I have to say that I've had enough. I'm tired of being played for a fool, and now I'm angry. You have to help me. I need a fresh pair of eyes to help me to make sense of this. Just slow down, Benji. What's going on? Realising that he was racing too far ahead, James checked himself and caused Drew to stand still with him. I'm so very, very sorry, Drew. I've got a real shock for you. It's very, very bad news. Drew braced himself for the bombshell. It's Sally. Unwilling to guess at the worst, Drew merely looked at James. Yes, Drew, she's dead. She's been murdered. Drew dropped his head into his hands and stifled a sob. Then he gathered himself and looked earnestly at his brother-in-law. Is it the same murderer? He asked. I think that's a safe assumption. It's the same modus operandi, said James. Understanding the full implication of this sentence, Drew merely nodded. It was obvious that Sally had been strangled. Here? Asked Drew. James said that this was the case. And what on earth can I do? Said Drew. Forbes thinks that there's something weird about the crime scene. If you think you can stomach it, I'd like you to have a look. He reckons it's been staged, but we simply can't grasp the thinking behind it. Someone is playing games with me, and I don't like being made a fool of. This isn't a game, and it has to stop. Will you look? Said James. Drew gave just one decisive nod of the head. This wasn't a scene he'd relish viewing, but he wanted at least to try and help, and so he followed James and walked down to the archives. Drew had a strong sense of déjà vu, but there was no mystery to that. He really had been there before. Under exactly the same circumstances, he'd walked to see the scene of Rick's last few tortured moments. The similarities to what he saw now were obvious. Sally lay in contorted pose with the same horrific injury to her throat in almost exactly the same spot in the room. There were some differences, however. Although it couldn't be said that Sally looked at peace, there was less collateral damage than he'd seen at Rick's scene of death. There was no profusion of blood. Only at the site of the wound had there been any bleeding, and it was apparent that she'd put up less of a fight. Drew could only hope that this meant that she'd suffered less. There were no signs of a struggle and no overturned chairs, but there was a sense of disarray and clutter that was barely perceptible. Forbes stood to meet James and Drew as they hovered on the threshold. Just stay there, we're going over the whole scene again, said Forbes. Something doesn't feel right, apart from the obvious. We're keeping the room clear until we've gone over it all again. Turning to Drew, he continued, Something feels odd about the placement of the furniture. What do you make of it? It feels messy, said Drew, not in the sense that it's been trashed, but disarranged or disordered. But that's just it, said Forbes. It's not disarranged. I'm sure it's been placed particularly arranged so as to be out of place. Look at these chairs. They're in a perfect line. Why? Or take that red cardigan. Nobody knows who it belongs to, so why is it folded onto the back of that chair? The chairs at the back aren't tucked under the table as they should be, but are all against the back wall. I've never seen anything like it, and I have to admit that it's creeping me out. We need an artist's eye here, I think, Drew, said James. Can you manage to detach yourself from the horror before you? Don't think about the subject matter, but take it in as a whole. Step back and look at it in an abstract sense, then tell me what you see. With no further idea but to try and help, Drew stepped back and squinted at the scene before him, as he would when sizing up a landscape to be painted on plein air. On both hands he extended his thumb and forefinger to form the corners of an imaginary rectangle in an attempt to crop out the scene as for a canvas. As he did so, signs of comprehension grew upon his countenance. "What is it, Drew?" asked James. "I hardly know. I've got a vague sensation that it's a stage sense of perspective," said Drew. He took up his squinting again and nodded to himself. Yes, he was sure now. "Can you get a wide-angled photo of this room? I think it would be easy to explain if you could see it in 2D. Without a word, Forbes jumped to the task and was soon linking the camera to his laptop to download the image. "Do you say that nobody can account for that red cardigan?" asked Drew. "Nobody knows who it could belong to. It certainly wasn't Sally's. Everybody said she hated red and never wore that colour. It's the wrong size, too. We've gone over it for prints and DNA, but there's none we recognise. I'd say that it's never been worn, but it's been well thumbed on a shop hanger," said Forbes. "I think I have an idea," said Drew. "It's outlandish, but everything has lost any sense of reality, so I don't see why my theory shouldn't hold. Can we take the laptop somewhere else so that I can talk you through it?" Drew didn't want to contaminate the scene, and that was ostensibly why he suggested finding another room. There was no shame in admitting that he didn't want to chat over theories next to the dead body of his dear friend and colleague, but Drew hadn't the emotional energy to explain all of that. Not that any such explanation was necessary. The three men found a quiet table and clustered around the laptop, eager to get to the bottom of this eerie arrangement of furniture in the archives, and hopefully also get to the bottom of who had killed dear Sally. "I think it's all about creating a sense of perspective. It's what an artist would create in 2D to create a 3D flow. But in actual 3D, the effect feels weird. I think I'm right, and the cardigan clinches it," said Drew. Seeing that the others had no clue what he was talking about, Drew explained the principle from the beginning. An artist uses all sorts of techniques to create a three-dimensional effect and to draw your eye around a picture. When you look at a painting, your eye is manipulated so that you see what the artist wants you to see. More detail is painted in specific areas to give particular focal points, whereas background areas remain more sketchy. Artists would often place items purely to move your eye around the canvas. Colours tend to get lighter as you progress to the background, giving the effect of distance in addition to following lines of perspective. Drew now referred to the picture on the laptop. "Do you see how these chairs move the eye to the focal point?" Which unfortunately is Sally. Once you accept the idea that the furniture is moved to act as perspective guides, you can then accept the fact that these chairs at the back of the room are all pushed back as far as the room will allow to give a further sense of depth. "And what about the red cardigan?" asked Forbes. This is where it gets even more creepy," said Drew. "I said that colours become lighter as you progress towards the horizon line, and so, conversely, they get darker in the foreground to bring it really forward. Tints of red and green are very effective, even when mixed amongst other colours. However, in Constable's day, it was common practice to add a splash of red in the foreground. The smallest dab of red animates the whole canvas. Examples of the devices that Constable used include a red gypsy shawl, a cluster of poppies, and the collar on a horse. It's unlikely that such horse equipment would have been bright red, but it was altered for a particular artistic effect. I think the most pertinent example for our purposes would be Constable's painting of Willie Lott's cottage. In the bottom right-hand corner of the painting is a figure wearing a bright red top. If this cardigan doesn't belong to anybody here, I think it's safe to assume that it was placed, and I can only guess that this is the reason why." "You're saying that the crime scene has been staged in the manner of a Constable painting?" said Forbes. "One from the same period at least, but yes. The subject matter is a very different story, but the principle is there," said Drew. "I've never heard anything like it. Now that is creepy, said Forbes. So, you're looking for an artist, James. Or somebody who knows about art, said Drew, keen to keep himself out of the reckoning. Which doesn't particularly tell us anything that we didn't already know, said James. However, it does clarify our thoughts. I do think that the net is beginning to close about the culprit. I'm certainly instigating martial law. I know that everyone is innocent until proven guilty, but until I know that everyone is safe, this place is closed until further notice. And that now includes staff as well as the general public. It's gloves off and no holds barred. Drew couldn't remember ever having seen his brother-in-law looking so angry. He was a formidable force when even-tempered, and so he suspected that the murderer had now met his match. For the full book of Artful Designs, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.